All right, let's sink our teeth into something truly epic. We're talking about a story that didn't unfold over decades or even centuries, but across millions of years.
Millions. It's hard to even wrap your head around that timescale.
Totally. And it involves creatures that look like they stepped out of a dream or maybe a nightmare sometimes, branching paths, dead ends, and a journey that is absolutely not a simple climb up some ladder.
Definitely not the latter. That's the first myth to bust.
We're diving deep into human evolution today. Our mission today really is to grab this pile of material you've brought us, the articles, the research, the notes on our ancient ancestors, from the very first ape-like forms walking upright, all the way to us and, those fascinating, recently discovered extinct cousins.
Right.
And figure out what the hell are the most important things you actually need to know. What are the surprising nuggets, the stuff that sticks?
Exactly. We're tracing what you could call the unfolding tapestry. It's a narrative stitched together from fragments, right? Little bits found buried in the ground, chunks of fossilized bone, stone tools left behind on ancient landscapes.
Yeah.
Even incredible insights pulled from microscopic strands of ancient DNA these days.
Amazing.
It's fundamentally about understanding our own species' place in the grand story of life and really truly appreciating the wild, complex, sometimes unbelievable journey that resulted in us, Homo sapiens, being here, thinking these thoughts right now.
And believe me, this journey has some damn interesting plot twists.
Oh.
We're going to uncover why the whole idea of a single missing link is basically, scientific nonsense now.
Absolutely, yeah.
We'll touch on how ancient human groups weren't just rivals, but sometimes got intimate with each other.
The interbreeding story.
And why, if you're listening and you're of non-African descent, you probably carry a tiny genetic echo of a Neanderthal or maybe a Denisovan right inside you. It's wild.
The reality is always far more compelling and, frankly, messier than the simplified story.
No doubt about that. So in this absolutely sprawling epic, where do we even begin? How do you start?
The only place you can really start, by figuring out where we fit into the bigger picture. Our spot in the primate family, that's the bedrock.
Right. The undeniable truth is we're primates, like monkeys and apes.
Unequivocally.
Yeah.
When you look at the fundamental biological design, the grasping hands and feet, though obviously our feet are specialized now.
Yeah, for walking.
The forward-facing eyes giving us that stereoscopic vision, brains that are relatively large compared to other mammals. These are deep, shared primate traits. We're absolutely part of that club.
And then you get closer to home, our nearest living relatives. They aren't just any old monkeys or apes. They're the great apes of Africa.
That's right. Chimpanzees, including the bonobos, of course, and gorillas. The scientific consensus here is just rock solid. It's backed by mountains of genetic and anatomical evidence.
It's not really debated anymore, is it?
Not among scientists, no. If you line up our DNA with the chimpanzees, the similarity is just stunning. We're talking like 98, 99% identical, depending on how you count. We're basically siblings on the grand tree of life, not distant cousins.
And this genetic kinship, it points us to the very moment our story as humans begins. The big split.
Precisely. At some point, the lineage that would eventually lead to us diverged from the lineage that would lead to modern chimps. And the best estimates, based on genetic dating, the molecular clock, and the fossil record, put that momentous event somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago.
6 or 7 million.
Yeah. And the science is clear. This happened in Africa. This divergence is the genesis, the absolute starting point of the hominin story.
Hominin. Okay, that term is going to come up a lot. Let's nail exactly what that means in this context so we're all on the same page.
Great point. Hominin is the scientific term for our side of the family tree after that split from the chimpanzee lineage. So it includes Homo sapiens, that's us, all the extinct species that are more closely related to us than they are to chimps, and our immediate ancestors on that branch. So, species like Australopithecus, afarensis, Lucy species, Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, they're all hominins.
But chimps aren't.
No, chimps are not hominins. They're on their own distinct evolutionary path after that split. They're our closest living relatives, but they aren't hominins.
Okay, so we split from chimp ancestry in Africa millions of years ago. We're now on the hominin branch. That's the what and where. But the big question is, how the heck do scientists know any of this? I mean, we're talking about things that happened before any written records, before anyone was around taking notes.
Right. That's the magic of the science, or really a whole bunch of sciences working together. The main umbrella term is paleoanthropology.
Like the study of ancient humans, fossils and stuff?
Exactly. It combines the digging for fossils, it's sort of the core paleoanthropology, with archaeology, genetics, geology, climate science. It's truly interdisciplinary. You need all those pieces. Fossil bones are absolutely fundamental. They give us the physical blueprint, right?
Yep.
How tall were they? How did they move? Crucially, did they walk upright? Bipedalism. How big were their brains, and how did that change over millions of years? The bones tell that story.
And archaeology brings the behavior side into it, what they did.
Spot on. Archaeology uncovers the things our ancestors did. Stone tools are a massive source of information. How intelligent were they? What could they make? What were they eating? Remnants of ancient fires tell us about controlling heat. Animal bones with telltale cut marks show us they were processing meat, not just, grabbing fruit.
Yeah.
Even preserved footprints, millions of years old. They offer a direct window into how they walked, maybe even hints about their social groups.
Those footprints,
Yep.
the Latoli ones, just picturing them walking across an ancient ash field. It's mind-blowing.
It truly is, gives you goosebumps.
Yeah.
But arguably the biggest game changer in recent times, especially for understanding the later parts of the story, has been ancient DNA analysis.
Genetics, pulling the actual code of life out of old bones.
Absolutely revolutionary. We can now extract DNA, sometimes surprisingly intact, from ancient bones and teeth that are tens, even hundreds of thousands of years old, and sequence it.
Wow.
This allows us to map the relationships between different ancient human groups with incredible precision, far beyond what bones alone could tell us sometimes. And, as we hinted, it's provided undeniable proof of interaction, specifically interbreeding, between different hominin species. Stuff we never could have guessed just from looking at fossils.
Okay, so the story's told by bone fragments, stone chips, those amazing footprints, and the molecular code itself. And all of it points to one single crucial place for the beginning of this whole damn journey.
Africa. It is unequivocally the cradle of humanity. There's no serious scientific debate about that.
And it wasn't just where we started. It was where everything happened for millions and millions of years.
That's a point worth hammering home. For the first several million years after that split from the chimp lineage, let's say from 7 million down to about 2 million years ago, all the action, all the known hominin evolution, all the species we've found are found only in Africa.
Only in Africa for that long.
Yeah. Look at the fossil record for that huge chunk of time. Hominin fossils are almost exclusively African. It's quite striking.
That's a hell of a long time for one continent to be the sole stage for our entire lineage's evolution.
It really speaks volumes about Africa's importance in shaping us. And crucially, it wasn't a static backdrop. Africa's diverse and constantly changing environments, we're talking shifts in climate, vegetation, everything, were crucial in forging the adaptability that would eventually allow one African species, Homo sapiens, us, to leave and populate the entire damn planet.
And we see that reflected in the genetics too, right? You mentioned the interbreeding.
Exactly. That genetic signature of interbreeding with archaic groups like Neanderthals and Denisovans, which we'll definitely get into, it's found primarily in non-African populations today.
Which tells you that specific mixing happened after our ancestors had already been evolving in Africa for a very long time and then started migrating out and met these other groups.
Precisely. The deep roots, the foundational evolution, the stuff that made us fundamentally human in the first place, happened right there in Africa over millions of years.
Okay, so the stage for this epic drama was Africa, but it wasn't some peaceful, unchanging Garden of Eden. Let's talk about that environmental backdrop. Sounds like it was pretty chaotic.
Yeah, dynamic is maybe an understatement sometimes. The vast sweep of hominin evolution unfolded during two major geological epochs, the Pliocene and then the Pleistocene, which is basically the ice ages.
Right.
And the defining environmental characteristic of this entire period was change. We see significant global cooling trends overall, drying in many regions, especially Africa, but crucially, wild, rapid climate swings on top of those longer trends.
So the planet wasn't just slowly getting cooler and drier, it was kind of jerking back and forth like a roller coaster.
Pretty much. Geologically speaking, these were big shifts happening relatively quickly, and these fluctuations fundamentally reshaped landscapes. Habitats would shift dramatically, forests might shrink and give way to woodlands or grasslands, then maybe forests expand again later. It wasn't a simple one-way street from forest to savanna.
That leads to that old classic idea, doesn't it? The savanna hypothesis. The story we all learned in school, maybe. That we started walking on two legs because the forests disappeared and we had to cross open grasslands.
Yeah, that was the neat, elegantly simple story for a long time. Shrinking forests forced hominins onto the ground, and bipedalism was supposedly better for seeing over tall grass, We're traveling long distances efficiently across these new open plains. Makes intuitive sense.
But the science has moved past that simple picture now.
Significantly. Yeah. The more nuanced understanding we have now, based on better dating and environmental reconstructions, is that bipedalism seems to have emerged much earlier. We're talking maybe 4, 5, 6 million years ago. Millions of years before extensive open savannas became truly widespread in Africa.
So they weren't walking upright because of the savanna?
Probably not directly, no. Early hominins, when bipedalism first appeared, were likely navigating a mosaic of habitats, patches of forest, denser woodland, more open bushland, maybe some riverside grasslands, all mixed together in the landscape.
Okay, so it wasn't just about adapting to the savanna. It was about adapting to a world where the environment itself was unstable and unpredictable, always changing.
That's where the variability selection hypothesis comes in. Yeah. And it's a really powerful concept that's gaining a lot of traction. It argues that the key evolutionary pressure wasn't adapting to one specific environment, like the savanna, but adapting to constant, unpredictable change across a whole range of different environments.
The instability itself was the driving force.
Exactly. This kind of pressure favored hominins that had high degrees of adaptability and behavioral flexibility. You couldn't afford to be a super specialist tied to one particular niche because that niche might shrink or disappear in the next few thousand years, or even faster.
Right. Bad bet.
You had to be a generalist, able to exploit different types of food, find shelter in varied landscapes, and critically innovate, come up with new solutions as conditions shifted under your feet.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. If the rules of the game keep changing, being really good at just one strategy is risky. Being good at adapting is the real superpower.
And you see the evidence for this all over the place in the hominin record. Think about the anatomy of early bipeds like Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy species, built for walking efficiently on the ground and still capable of climbing trees. That screams adaptability to a mixed, changing habitat.
Yeah.
Look at the evolution of tools over millions of years, from those simple Oldowan choppers to the more complex Acheulean hand axes, and eventually to the sophisticated blade tools and composite weapons of later hominins. That shows a growing capacity to find new ways to interact with and exploit the environment.
And ultimately, the fact that our species, Homo sapiens, could eventually leave Africa and spread across the entire globe. I mean, from scorching deserts to freezing Arctic tundra. That's the ultimate expression of dealing with variability, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's the hallmark of our lineage. While more specialized hominin lineages eventually went extinct, often seemingly tied to specific environmental conditions or niches, our lineage, the ultimate generalists, thrived in a world defined by constant change. This capacity to cope with variability wasn't just a useful trick. It was a fundamental sculptor of our biology and behavior, likely driving brain growth and pushing us towards ever greater cognitive flexibility.
Okay, so we've set the stage. Africa, millions of years of crazy climate swings pushing our ancestors towards adaptability. What were the actual physical and behavioral traits that started making these homins distinct? The things that really point towards human, even way back then?
Well, number one has to be bipedalism. Standing tall, walking on two legs.
This is the first, most fundamental adaptation that really defines the hominin lineage after that split from the chimp line, right?
Without a doubt. It's one of the earliest defining hominin traits. It appeared very early, well over 4 million years ago, maybe even earlier, based on some fragmentary evidence.
And the poster child for early bipedalism is still Lucy, right? Australopithecus afarensis.
Absolutely. She's still the star. That incredibly famous partial skeleton found in Ethiopia in the 70s. Her skeleton showed clear adaptations for upright walking in her lower body. Her pelvis flared outwards, differently from an ape's, more like ours. Her knee joint could fully straighten, allowing for efficient striding.
But you mentioned she was a mosaic. She wasn't just walking.
Exactly. That's the fascinating part. While her lower body was clearly adapted for bipedalism, her upper body retained some more ape-like ancestral features. She had relatively long arms compared to her legs, and slightly curved finger and toe bones.
Good for climbing.
Great for climbing. So she wasn't exclusively terrestrial. She was clearly a very competent upright walker, but she could also still move around effectively in the trees.
And the most powerful evidence for how they walked isn't even a skeleton, is it? It's those Laetoli footprints.
Oh, absolute goosebump stuff. These are real tracks. Footprints left by early hominins, very likely Australopithecus afarensis, walking through wet volcanic ash in Tanzania about 3.6 million years ago.
And it hardens like cement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The ash hardened, got buried by more ash and preserved these prints perfectly. You can see the clear heel strike, the way the weight transferred along the side of the foot, the big toe pushing off in line with the others, not sticking out to the side like an ape's for grasping. It's a gait remarkably similar to modern human walking. It's like reaching back through time and seeing them take those very steps. It's unbelievable.
So why stand up? What were the advantages, besides maybe getting a better view over the grass?
Well, that's debated, but several major advantages seem likely. Critically, it frees up the hands. That's huge. Free hands mean you can carry things, food, back to a safer spot. Tools once they're invented. Helpless infants. Bipedalism can also be more energy efficient for covering long distances compared to knuckle walking like chimps and gorillas, or walking on all fours, and potentially better visibility over vegetation to spot food or predators, maybe even helping with temperature regulation by exposing less body surface to the direct sun.
Okay, so hands are free, you're walking around more efficiently. What do you do with those newly freed hands? Get handy? Make stuff?
Tool use, exactly. Now, while walking upright is ancient, the systematic production and use of stone tools appears somewhat later in the record. The earliest widely accepted evidence for this kicks in around 2.6 million years ago. This marks the beginning of what archaeologists call the Oldowan tool tradition.
Though there's that hint in the research you mentioned of maybe even earlier tools, around 3.3 million years ago?
Right. There are finds from a site called Lomekwi in Kenya, dated to 3.3 million years ago, that seem to show very simple modified stones. If confirmed, this pushes tool use back significantly, even before the first fossils confidently assigned to our genus, Homo. So maybe even earlier Australopithecines were doing some basic tool modification.
But the older ones, starting 2.6 million years ago, that's the first widespread, consistent evidence.
Yes, that's when it really seems to take off.
What were these early Oldowan tools like? We're talking pretty simple stuff, right? Not fancy knives.
Very simple compared to later technology, definitely. Basically, it involves taking one stone, a core, and hitting it with another stone, a hammerstone, to knock off sharp-edged flakes. The core itself might be used as a crude chopper, or the flakes, which can be incredibly sharp, were used for cutting and scraping.
Doesn't sound like rocket science, but why was this revolutionary for our ancestors?
Because it opened up entirely new dietary possibilities. Those sharp flakes allowed them to do things they couldn't do before, like slicing meat off animal carcasses they might have scavenged, cracking open long bones to get at the incredibly nutrient-rich fatty marrow inside food that was completely inaccessible before. They could also process tough plant materials more effectively, like tubers or fibrous stems. It broadened their menu significantly.
And this wasn't just like instinctual behavior, right? Making even these simple tools required some serious brain power.
Absolutely. This is a crucial marker of developing cognition. It requires foresight, realizing you might need a sharp edge later and planning to make one. It requires planning, figuring out which rocks will fracture predictably, how to hold them, where to strike them. It requires sophisticated motor control and hand-eye coordination. Even this basic technology implies a significant mental leap beyond what we see in other primates.
And speaking of mental leaps, the biggest trend in our lineage, especially once the genus Homo gets going, is that massive expansion of the brain, encephalization.
Big brain time, yes. This is arguably the defining story within the evolution of our genus, Homo. There's a massive long-term trend towards increasing brain size and, presumably, complexity.
Let's get a feel for the scale of that change. How much bigger are we talking?
Okay, so early hominins like Australopithecus had brains roughly comparable in size to modern chimpanzees, maybe around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters or cc.
Bank-sized.
Pretty much. Then, with the first species often placed in our genus, Homo habilis, it jumps up noticeably to an average of about 610 cc. Still small, but a definite increase. Then comes Homo erectus, and we see another significant leap, averaging around 900 to 1100 cc, sometimes even more, getting much closer to modern sizes.
And then Homo sapiens S.
We landed about 1350 cc on average today. So over the course of a few million years, brain size basically tripled in our lineage. It's not a perfectly smooth, straight line. There are periods of relative stasis and then faster growth, but the overall trajectory is undeniable and dramatic.
And it wasn't just about getting bigger, right? The internal organization, the wiring, was changing too.
Yes, that's absolutely key. Size isn't everything. The brain was also reorganizing internally. We see evidence, particularly in later hominins, for proportional increases in areas associated with higher cognitive functions. The prefrontal cortex involved in planning and decision-making, areas linked to language processing, complex problem-solving, abstract thought, sophisticated social interactions.
And you can link this big brain growth back to that unstable climate we talked about, the variability selection idea.
There's strong evidence for a connection, yeah. It seems the fastest phase of brain expansion in our lineage occurred during periods of particularly intense climate variability, roughly between about 800,000 and 200,000 years ago.
So bigger, more complex brains were the solution to navigating those unpredictable worlds.
That's the argument. Having a bigger, more flexible, more adaptable brain, capable of learning, innovation, and complex social strategies, was likely a huge advantage for dealing with those constantly shifting environmental challenges. It fueled our ability to figure things out.
Which brings us to perhaps the most complex and in many ways the most uniquely us traits. Complex language and symbolic thought, culture, art, all that stuff.
Right, the capacity for complex syntactical language, abstract thinking, creating symbols that stand for things, making art, building these incredibly elaborate cumulative cultures.
Yeah.
This is where Homo sapiens really seems to distinguish itself, even if we now see hints that the roots of some of these abilities might go deeper, maybe even back to Neanderthals or Homo erectus.
And because language doesn't fossilize, you can't dig up a conversation. The timeline for its origin is notoriously tricky and debated.
Exactly. We can't find the first sentence, but we can look at the indirect archaeological evidence. And the explosion of sophisticated symbolic behavior shows up clearly in the archaeological records starting within the last 100,000 years or so, and it's predominantly associated with early Homo sapiens in Africa and then as they spread out.
What does that look like on the ground? What kind of artifacts are we talking about?
We're talking about the earliest definitive art. Things like engraved pieces of ochre with geometric patterns, beads, deliberately made for personal adornment from shells or ostrich eggshells. The widespread, systematic use of pigments like red ochre, not just for practical reasons, but almost certainly for symbolic purposes like body painting, rituals, maybe coloring objects or burials.
So they cared about how they looked, about meaning.
Absolutely. These aren't just random objects, they are loaded with meaning. They show the capacity for abstract ideas, for shared symbols within a group, and the ability to transmit complex cultural information across generations. This is a profound cognitive leap.
So these defining traits, walking upright, making tools, growing bigger brains, using symbols and language, they didn't just pop up independently in isolation, they're all connected.
No, they were part of a deeply interconnected, co-evolving package. It's a classic feedback loop. Bipedalism frees the hands, which allows for more sophisticated tool use. Better tools and maybe cooking food could influence diet, jaw size, gut size. Perhaps freeing up metabolic energy that could then support a larger, more energy-hungry brain.
Right.
A larger, more complex brain supports more intricate social life, better communication, and more advanced cognitive abilities, which in turn enables the development of more complex tool-making, hunting strategies, and eventually symbolic behavior. And these cultural innovations then create new selective pressures, potentially driving further biological and cognitive change. It's a constant dynamic interplay. Language is a perfect example, a cultural and cognitive innovation that must have reshaped social dynamics and likely selected for brains even better suited for processing it.
Okay, so we've got the core package of emerging human traits developing on this dynamic African stage. Now let's really look at the characters in this drama, the human family tree itself. And we need to get one thing straight right off the bat, something you mentioned earlier.
Get rid of that picture, the one you see everywhere, of a single line of figures walking from left to right, starting hunched over like an ape and getting progressively taller and more human-like until you get to a modern human. That linear march of progress.
Yeah, that image, it's absolute bullshit, isn't it?
It's scientifically dead wrong. It's a total misrepresentation. The reality is vastly more complex and, frankly, much more interesting. The human family tree is not a ladder you climb. It's a complex, densely branched bush.
A bush, not a ladder.
Exactly. Think of a chaotic, diverse array of species that emerged, experimented with different adaptations, often coexisted in the same time and place, and frequently went extinct. Dead ends were common.
How many different branches, different species are we talking about on this bush?
Paleoanthropologists currently recognize somewhere between 15 and 20 distinct hominin species in our recent evolutionary past, maybe even more, depending on who you ask and how they classify things. And that number is always being refined as new fossils are discovered and analyzed. The exact relationships between all of them are often hotly debated too. It's messy.
So, some of these extinct species were on the direct path leading to us, Homo sapiens, but most of them were more like cousins. ancestral cousins.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it like your extended family tree. Some branches lead directly back from you to your parents, grandparents, and so on. That's your direct lineage. But you also have aunts, uncles, great aunts, second cousins once removed. They're all part of the same broader family. They share common ancestors with you further back, but they're not on your direct line.
Right.
Many extinct hominin species were like those ancestral cousins. They branched off, explored different adaptive strategies, different ways of being a bipedal ape with a changing brain. But ultimately, those particular paths didn't lead to the present day. They hit evolutionary dead ends.
How the hell do scientists even begin to map this incredibly tangled bush? How do they figure out who's related to whom?
It's intense detective work, pulling together evidence from multiple fields. First, you have to date the fossils as precisely as possible, using techniques like radiometric dating or by looking at the geological layers they're found in. That places them in time.
Okay.
Then, you study the anatomy in microscopic detail. You compare features, looking for shared traits. Which traits are primitive, meaning they're inherited from a much older, distant ancestor? Which are derived, meaning they're newly evolved features shared only by a specific group, suggesting a closer relationship.
So more shared new features usually means more closely related.
Generally, yes. And increasingly, ancient DNA is becoming a powerful flashlight in this process, especially for more recent hominins like Neanderthals and Denisovans. DNA can confirm relationships suggested by bones, sometimes challenge them, and crucially reveal things like interbreeding that bones alone might never show us.
And a really crucial point that blows up the latter idea is that it wasn't just one species neatly replacing the previous one. Coexistence was common. Multiple kinds of hominins were often around at the same time.
This is key and often surprising to people. For significant stretches of our evolutionary history, multiple distinct hominin species lived in the same general geographic areas at the same time. It wasn't a relay race. It was often a shared track.
Like who? Give us some examples.
Well, fairly early on, you had species like Australopithecus afarensis, likely overlapping with other Australopithecine forms. Later, and perhaps more strikingly, you had Homo habilis and early Homo erectus overlapping in East Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe 500,000 years.
500,000 years living side by side.
Roughly, yeah. And much later, of course, we have the well-documented overlap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia for thousands of years, and Homo sapiens overlapping with Denisovans in Asia.
So they weren't just neatly replacing each other in a sequence. Boom, boom, boom.
Not at all. This implies a world where different human-like groups were encountering each other, interacting in complex ways, maybe competing for the same resources, maybe avoiding each other, perhaps sometimes even cooperating. And as we now know for sure from the genetics, definitely sometimes mixing their gene pools through interbreeding.
Which neatly brings us back to why that whole concept of the missing link is just, it's antiquated crap, right? It doesn't fit this picture at all.
Precisely. The idea of a single missing link really belongs to a bygone era of thinking about evolution, a time when people envisioned it as a simple chain, like links in a chain or beads on a string, and you just needed to find that one specific bead that neatly connected two known ones, like apes and humans.
Where did that idea even come from originally? 19th century?
Yeah, it's rooted in older philosophical concepts like the Great Chain of Being, this idea of a hierarchical order in nature, and some early, sometimes overly simplistic or misapplied, interpretations of Darwinian evolution. Scientists in the 19th century, folks like Ernst Haeckel, were literally looking for the intermediate form between apes and humans. Haeckel even made up a name for this hypothetical creature, Pithecanthropus alalis, ape man without speech, before any relevant fossils were even found.
Wow. And then anytime a significant new fossil came up, especially one that seemed intermediate, the media would jump all over it and call it the missing link.
Absolutely. Sensationalism sells. Fossils like the first Homo erectus found in Java, Java man, or the tongue-child skull, Australopithecus africanus from South Africa, or even the truly groundbreaking Lucy skeleton, Australopithecus afarensis, were all hailed in headlines as the missing link at various times. Even the infamous Piltdown Man hoax was partly fueled by this public and scientific desire to find the definitive link in Britain.
So why is that term so problematic now? Why do scientists basically hate it?
Because it completely misrepresents the branching, bushy nature of evolution that the actual fossil record shows us. Scientists today don't look for the missing link. They look for transitional fossils. and that term means something different.
Okay, what's the difference?
Transitional fossils aren't halfway points on a single line. They are fossils that show a mosaic of traits, some older ancestral features inherited from earlier forms, and some newer, derived features characteristic of a later group. They illuminate a specific point in time on a particular branch of the evolutionary tree, showing how one group evolved from a shared ancestor into something different, or how different adaptations arose.
Like Lucy being transitional because she clearly walked upright, which is a derived human trait, but still had those ape-like long arms and curved fingers for climbing, which are more ancestral traits.
Perfect example. She's a beautiful transitional fossil. She shows us a snapshot of evolution in action on the branch leading towards us, demonstrating how bipedalism evolved while arboreal adaptations were still retained. But she's not the link between apes and humans, because there wasn't just one link. There were many steps, many forms, many experiments, and the path branched multiple times. And remember, we didn't evolve from modern chimpanzees or gorillas. We share a common ancestor with them way back. Scientists talk about the last common ancestor, or LCA. That LCA, which lived maybe 7 or 8 million years ago, was likely neither a modern chimp nor a modern human, but something different that gave rise to both lineages.
So every new fossil discovery isn't filling a gap in a single chain. It's adding more detail, maybe revealing new branches or clarifying connections within that complex, messy bush.
Exactly. It's about mapping the full, rich history of evolutionary experimentation, divergence, and extinction, not finding a single mythical linear connection. The popular obsession with finding the missing link is really just a distraction from the much richer, more complex, and frankly, more interesting reality of how evolution actually works.
Okay, let's dive into that bush then and start looking at some of the actual Meiji players, particularly the early ones, the Australopithecines and the dawn of our own genus, Homo.
You absolutely have to begin with Australopithecus afarensis, our old friend Lucy and her species. They're just so foundational.
A truly critical player in the story. Where and when were they active? Remind us.
They thrived in East Africa. We find their fossils in places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania between about 3.85 and 2.95 million years ago. That's their main time window.
And just stop and think about their sheer persistence. You mentioned this in the outline. They existed as a recognizable species for over 900,000 years.
Almost a million years. It's staggering. Compare that to our own species, Homo sapiens, who've only been around for maybe 300,000 years so far. Afarensis had a really good long run.
A remarkably successful species in terms of longevity. Besides Lucy's famous partial skeleton, what other key finds tell us about them?
Well, the Licoli footprints we talked about, that's direct behavioral evidence of their walking. And there's also the incredible skeleton of a very young child nicknamed Silam, or Lucy's baby, found in Dikika, Ethiopia. It's even more complete than Lucy in some ways, and gave us amazing insights into their growth, development, and things like the shape of their shoulder blades, confirming those climbing abilities.
And their physical traits. You keep emphasizing the mosaic, the blend.
Yes, that blend is their absolute hallmark. Down below the waist pelvis, legs, feet, everything points to clear, habitual bipedalism. The shape of the pelvis is broad and bowl-like, supporting upright posture. The angle of the femur coming down to the knee joint allows the knee to be positioned under the body's center of gravity for stable walking. The foot has an arch, and the big toe is in line. All signs of walking upright.
But the upper body told a different story.
Exactly. Their upper body retained more ancestral ape-like traits. They had relatively long arms compared to their legs, and their finger and toe bones were somewhat curved. Their shoulder joint was angled slightly upwards. These are all features useful for climbing and moving through trees. So they were incredibly capable upright walkers on the ground, but they could also still climb trees effectively when needed.
Which makes perfect sense given they lived in those shifting mosaic environments we talked about, right? You'd need to be able to move efficiently on the ground, but maybe still escape danger, sleep, or find food up in the trees.
Absolutely. That flexible locomotion was likely a major advantage in that kind of world. Now, their brain size was still quite small, very similar to a modern chimpanzee's, maybe in that 400 or 500 cc range on average.
Still ape-sized upstairs.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And their face was also still quite ape-like in some ways, a flat nose, a jaw that projected forward, prognathism, although their canine teeth were significantly smaller and more human-like than those of apes, suggesting changes in diet or social behavior.
What about their diet? What were they eating?
Analysis of their teeth, the size, shape, and microwear patterns suggest they were primarily plant eaters. Fruits, leaves, seeds, nuts. But their fairly robust jaws and large molars with thick enamel indicate they could also chew tougher, more fibrous fallback foods when preferred items were scarce. They weren't delicate eaters. They also exhibited marked sexual dimorphism. Males were significantly larger and heavier than females, a common pattern in primates with certain kinds of social structures.
So Lucy and her kind, Australopithecus afarensis, they sit at a really crucial evolutionary junction, a pivot point.
They really do. Given their early date, their clear bipedalism, combined with retained primitive features and their location, Australopithecus is widely considered a strong candidate for being the ancestor, or very close to the ancestry, of several later hominin lineages.
Like who?
Well, certainly later species of Australopithecus, also the robust Paranthropus lineage. Those guys were fascinating cousins who went down a very specialized path of massive jaws and teeth for grinding tough vegetation and eventually died out. And critically, Australopithecus, or a very similar, closely related species, is the most likely ancestor for the very earliest species placed in our own genus, Homo.
Ah, the dawn of Homo. Our own lineage begins.
The emergence of Homo habilis, which literally means handyman. This is the species that, controversially at first but now generally accepted, first gets placed firmly into our genus, Homo.
When and where did they appear on the scene?
Roughly between 2.4 and 1.4 million years ago, so overlapping quite a bit with the later Australopithecines. And we find their fossils in both East Africa, like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and also in South Africa.
And the name handyman that comes directly from the association with tools.
Exactly. When Lewis and Mary Leakey discovered the definitive Homo habilis fossils at Olduvai Gorge in the early 1960s, they were found in geological layers that also contained those early Oldowan stone tools we discussed. The inference was this slightly bigger-brained hominin, compared to the Australopithecines found nearby, must have been the toolmaker, hence the name.
Okay, let's compare Homo habilis directly to Australopithecus. What's really changing physically? What makes them Homo?
The most notable change, the one that really justified putting them in our genus, is the brain size. It jumps up significantly from the Australopithecine average. H. habilis averages around 610 cc. Still small compared to us, less than half our size, but it's a substantial increase, maybe 30–40% larger than Lucy's species.
And the skull shape changed too.
Yes. The skull starts to show a slightly rounder shape, less constricted behind the eyes. You see the beginnings of a more vertical forehead, though still quite sloping.
What about the face and teeth? Still ape-like.
Jaws and teeth are generally less robust, more lightly built than in most Australopithecines. The tooth row tends to be more curved, more parabolic like ours, rather than the more parallel rows seen in apes, though the molars still had thick enamel, suggesting they still ate a fairly varied and sometimes tough diet.
But some older, more primitive traits hung around in their body plan.
Yes, definitely. They still retain fairly long arms relative to their legs, similar body proportions to the Australopithecines. They were relatively short-statured, maybe only 3 to 4.5 feet tall on average, and their face still projected outward somewhat, though perhaps less so than in Australopithecus.
But definitely walking upright efficiently.
Oh yes, fully bipedal on the ground. Foot fossils attributed to H. habilis show a well-developed arch, similar to modern humans, which is crucial for shock absorption and efficient walking. Interestingly, their finger bones are somewhat intermediate. They show some slight curvature, suggesting some climbing ability might still have been retained, but they also show clear features associated with dexterity and the powerful grip needed for manipulating objects and making tools.
And the Oldowan toolkit, that was their big cultural contribution, the reason for the name.
That's why they got the name, yes. The Oldowan is that earliest widespread stone tool tradition we see in the record, starting around 2.6 million years ago. These very simple choppers and sharp flakes produced by hitting rocks together.
But even that simple technology, as we discussed, implied a significant cognitive leap over just using unmodified stones.
Absolutely. It required understanding fracture mechanics, planning sequences of actions, selecting appropriate raw materials, fine motor control. It was a fundamental step in actively modifying the environment and expanding dietary options, particularly access to meat and marrow.
Is it completely settled science that H. habilis were the only ones making these early Oldowan tools, or is there some debate?
There's still some debate. As we mentioned, the earliest tools from Lamekwi at 3.3 million years ago, if they are tools, predate H. habilis. And even the earliest Oldowan tools at 2.6 million years ago might slightly predate the very earliest confirmed H. habilis fossils. This opens the possibility that perhaps some later Australopithecines, or maybe even the robust Paranthropus species who lives at the same time, were also capable of making and using basic stone tools. The association between H. habilis and Oldowan is strong, but maybe not exclusive, especially right at the beginning.
So their diet was probably flexible, using those tools for opportunistic hunting or more likely scavenging carcasses. What about their social life? Any clues?
It's harder to reconstruct, but likely they lived in social groups, perhaps larger or more complexly organized than earlier hominins. The cognitive demands of toolmaking, potentially sharing meat resources, navigating complex landscapes, maybe defending kills from predators, all these factors probably favored stronger social bonds, enhanced cooperation, and maybe increasingly sophisticated communication. Not necessarily full language yet, but moving in that direction perhaps.
And where do they fit on that messy family bush? Are they definitely our direct ancestor, the step right before Homo erectus?
Their spot is pivotal, but still quite debated. They're classified as the first Homo, but that classification itself was controversial when first proposed, forcing scientists to actually tweak the definition of the genus Homo to include them, mainly by lowering the brain size threshold. Some researchers still argue they should be reclassified back into Australopithecus, or maybe a different genus entirely. And critically, the idea of a simple straight line from H. habilis directly evolving into H. erectus is seriously challenged by the fossil evidence showing that these two species coexisted in East Africa for a substantial period.
Right, you mentioned that overlap. For how long?
From about 1.9 million years ago down about 1.44 million years ago. So for nearly 500,000 years, H. habilis and early H. erectus were both present on the same landscape.
So H. habilis didn't just neatly morph into H. erectus and disappear. They were contemporaries for a long time.
Exactly. This strongly suggests that H. habilis probably wasn't the direct ancestor of H. erectus. It's more likely that H. habilis represents a side branch that eventually went extinct, or perhaps both H. habilis and H. erectus evolved from a different, earlier common ancestor that we haven't clearly identified yet. There's also the complication of another potential early Homo species from the same time period, Homo rudolfensis, known from a famous skull, KNMER 1470. Is H. rudolfensis just a larger male variant of H. habilis, or is it a distinct species with its notably larger brain and flatter face? The debate continues.
So the dawn of our genus Homo was actually pretty complicated and murky, not a clear single step.
It really looks like an adaptive radiation, a period where multiple forms of early Homo and maybe late Australopithecines too were experimenting with different combinations of traits, slightly bigger brains, tool use, different diets and body sizes. H. habilis is undeniably transitional, a fascinating blend of older ape-like body proportions with a bigger brain and tool-making capacity. Its coexistence with H. erectus and other forms shows the birth of our genus was far from a neat linear step. It was a messy, branching period of evolutionary exploration, much more interesting than a simple line.
Okay, moving on from the handy but still somewhat transitional Homo habilis to a real game changer in the human story. Homo erectus. These guys were the world travelers, the first ones to really break out.
This is a massive chapter. Homo erectus is, in many ways, perhaps the most successful hominin species ever in terms of sheer duration. They're around for almost 2 million years.
2 million years. It's just mind-boggling persistence compared to us.
Truly remarkable evolutionary staying power. They first appear on the fossil record around 1.89 million years ago, and the last known population survived until maybe as recently as 110,000 years ago in Southeast Asia.
Incredible. And their biggest, most significant move, the thing they're famous for, was being the first hominin lineage to definitively migrate out of Africa and spread across the Old World.
Yes. This was a watershed moment in human evolution.
When did that first exodus begin? Was it early in their history?
It seems so. The earliest dates for Homo erectus outside of Africa are surprisingly old, perhaps starting around 1.8 to 1.9 million years ago. Almost as soon as they appear in Africa, they seem to be moving out. They spread relatively rapidly across vast swaths of Eurasia.
Their geographical reach was huge then. It's not just a little trip over the border.
Absolutely massive. We find Homo erectus fossils all across Africa, naturally, but also into Western Asia. The incredible early site at Denisovans in the Republic of Georgia has yielded multiple skulls dating to around 1.8 million years ago, and all the way across to East Asia. The famous discoveries in China, like Peking Man near Beijing, and in Indonesia on the island of Java, like the original Java man discovery, those are all Homo erectus. They adapted to incredibly diverse environments, from tropical forests to more temperate zones.
And you mentioned they survived on Java remarkably recently, long after they disappeared elsewhere.
Yes, the youngest known securely dated Homo erectus fossils come from a site called Ngandong on Java. Recent dating places them somewhere around 108,000 to 117,000 years ago,
Right.
which means they might have overlapped in that region with the ancestors of modern humans moving through Southeast Asia.
Wow. What drove them to leave Africa and spread so incredibly wide? What was pushing them?
It was likely a combination of factors, and it's still debated. Possibly following migrating animal herds that they hunted, maybe seeking out new resources as populations grew, perhaps adapting to changing climates and environments pushed them into new territories. Or maybe it was simply their new physical and behavioral adaptations allowed them to exploit a wider range of habitats than any previous hominin. Whatever the specific drivers, it was an absolutely monumental feat of adaptation and mobility for the time.
What were those key physical adaptations that allowed for this kind of marathon journey across continents? What changed from H. habilis?
The most striking change is in their body plan. Homo erectus had a much more modern, human-like body build compared to the earlier, more ape-like proportions of Australopithecines and H. habilis. They developed longer legs relative to their arms and torso.
Built for walking.
Exactly. They were clearly built for efficient, long-distance terrestrial locomotion walking, and maybe even endurance running. This body shape is a clear departure. It's much more like ours below the neck.
So physically starting to look a lot more like us from the neck down.
Much more so, yeah. They were also taller than earlier hominins, with estimates ranging from around 4'9" up to over 6 feet tall for some individuals. Body mass varied too, but they were generally larger and more robust. And the brain got significantly bigger again, averaging around 150 cc across the species' long history, though there's a lot of variation. That's a big jump from H. habilis and getting much closer to the modern human range. The overall brain structure was also becoming more complex, more human-like in its organization.
But the skull, the head, was still quite distinctive and different from ours, right? Not quite human-looking yet up there.
Definitely still robust and quite different. They typically had a large face that projected forward somewhat, a low-sloping forehead, and that absolutely massive shelf-like brow ridge right above the eyes. Sometimes it's almost like a visor, a broad, flat nose. The skull itself was typically long and low rather than high and rounded like ours, often with thick cranial bones and sometimes a slight ridge running along the top midline called a sagittal keel. Their jaws were still quite robust, though the teeth were smaller than in earlier species, and they usually lacked a prominent projecting chin like we have.
And tied to this geographic expansion and bigger brain, we see a major leap in tool technology with them. The Acheulean industry.
Yes, this is the signature technology strongly associated with Homo erectus across vast parts of their range, though not everywhere. It appears in Africa around 1.76 million years ago, significantly later than the first H. erectus fossils.
What sets Acheulean tools apart from the simpler Oldowan ones made by H. habilis? What's the upgrade?
The iconic tool is the hand axe. These were typically larger tools, often teardrop or oval-shaped, and crucially, they were shaped symmetrically on both sides. That's called bifacial working. They also made other large cutting tools like cleavers, which have a straight cutting edge at the end. These tools have a much more standardized, predetermined form compared to the rougher, more variable Oldowan choppers and flakes.
That deliberate shaping, the symmetry, that implies a significant jump in cognitive ability planning, right?
Absolutely. Making an Acheulean hand axe requires a much more complex sequence of actions, more foresight, and a sophisticated understanding of stone fracture mechanics. You have to select the right kind of stone, visualize the final three-dimensional shape within the raw block, and then execute a long series of precise strikes to remove flakes and achieve that symmetry and sharp edge all around. Researchers who study the cognitive demands of toolmaking, like Thomas Wynne, point to the mental template and spatial reasoning required for Acheulean tools as evidence of enhanced cognitive abilities compared to Oldowan makers.
And these hand axes, were they like the Swiss army knife of the Paleolithic? Used for everything?
Probably pretty versatile, yeah. Evidence suggests they were used for butchering large animals, cutting through hide, dismembering carcasses. Also likely used for processing plant materials, maybe digging up roots or tubers, working wood, perhaps even as projectile cores to get flakes from, or maybe even sometimes thrown. Some researchers have even speculated they might have had social or symbolic significance, but the primary use was likely functional.
You mentioned something called the Mobius line in the outline when discussing their tools. What's the significance of that? Why isn't Acheulean found everywhere H. erectus was?
Ah, the Mobius line. It's a fascinating puzzle. It's basically an imaginary line drawn decades ago by the archaeologist Mobius, running roughly through northern India. West of this line in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, Acheulean hand axes and cleavers are very common at Homo erectus sites. But east of this line, in East Asia, like China, Korea, Indonesia, classic Acheulean tools are largely absent or very rare. Instead, Homo erectus populations there continue to use simpler toolkits, more reminiscent of the Oldowan, often called chopper-chopping tool industries.
Why the difference? Did the Eastern populations just not get the memo?
That's the big debate. Why this technological divide? Was it a genuine cultural difference, different traditions of tool making? Or did Homo erectus populations in East Asia simply not need hand axes because they had access to other raw materials, like bamboo, which are incredibly versatile but wouldn't preserve in the archaeological record? Maybe they were making sophisticated tools out of bamboo that served the same purposes. Or maybe the first populations that migrated east left Africa before the Acheulean was fully developed there. It's a persistent mystery with no single accepted answer.
Beyond the stone tools, what other major behavioral or technological developments are linked to Homo erectus? Fire has to be a big one.
Controlled use of fire. Yes, this is arguably one of the most transformative developments in the entire course of human evolution. While finding definitive proof of controlled fire use, as opposed to just natural wildfires, can be tricky in early sites, the earliest widely accepted solid evidence comes from a site in Israel called Gesher Benat Yaakov, dated to around 790,000 years ago. There's potential. More debated evidence suggesting fire use might go back even earlier in Africa, perhaps over 1 million years ago.
What were the advantages of controlling fire? Why was it such a game changer?
Massive advantages. Warmth, obviously, allowing hominins to survive in colder climates and during colder nights. Protection from predators, keeping dangerous animals away from campsites at night. Light, extending the usable day. And crucially, the ability to cook food.
Cooking? That sounds huge.
It's potentially revolutionary. Cooking makes many foods, especially meat and tough, starchy plant foods like tubers, much easier to chew and digest. It unlocks more calories and nutrients. It neutralizes some toxins. Some researchers argue that the advent of cooking reduced the amount of energy needed for digestion, potentially freeing up metabolic resources that could then be allocated to supporting a larger, more energy-guzzling brain. It's a compelling idea. Plus, fire creates a social focal point, a hearth around which groups could gather, share food, interact.
And were they just scavenging carcasses like earlier hominins, or were they actively hunting now?
The evidence increasingly suggests that Homo erectus were capable and effective hunters, not just passive scavengers, although they probably did both. We find accumulations of bones from large animals at their sites, sometimes showing cut marks from stone tools overlaying carnivore tooth marks, suggesting they got there first or drove predators off. Butchered bones indicate they were systematically processing carcasses. This reliable access to meat and fat would have been vital for powering their larger bodies and brains, especially during those long migrations and in challenging environments.
What about their social life? Any hints of increasing complexity there? Bigger groups? Cooperation?
It's inferred, but likely yes. To hunt larger animals, navigate vast landscapes, maybe defend resources, it's probable they lived in larger, more cooperative social groups than earlier hominins. The famous site of Dmanisi in Georgia provides a poignant clue. One of the skulls belonged to an elderly individual who had lost all but one tooth years before dying.
Wow. How could they survive?
Exactly. For someone in that condition to survive for years, they would have absolutely needed significant care from others in their group. Others must have been processing food for them, sharing, protecting them. That implies a level of social support and compassion. We also see footprint trails at some sites that suggest groups moving together. There's speculation about the beginnings of a more marked sexual division of labor, maybe home bases where groups returned. They likely used caves and rock shelters regularly, and there's some debated evidence they might have built simple temporary shelters out of branches.
And you hinted earlier that maybe, just maybe, symbolic thought wasn't exclusively a Homo sapiens thing. Could Homo erectus have had some glimmer of abstract thought?
This is a really debated but incredibly intriguing area. The most compelling, though still somewhat controversial, piece of evidence comes from that shell found at Trinidad, Java, the same site where the original Java man Homo erectus fossil was discovered. On this freshwater mussel shell, dating back somewhere between 430,000 and 546,000 years ago, clearly within the time frame and location associated with Homo erectus, there is a distinct geometric zigzag pattern engraved on its surface.
An intentional pattern, not just scratches.
Microscopic analysis suggests it looks deliberate, made with a sharp tool, a repeated motif. If this is definitively proven to be a deliberate abstract marking, made by Homo erectus, it would absolutely shatter the timeline and be the earliest known example of abstract symbolic behavior by any hominin species by a huge margin.
What would that imply?
It would imply the cognitive ability to conceive of and create abstract patterns, perhaps for decoration, perhaps for some unknown meaning. It suggests the capacity for symbolism might have much, much deeper roots in our lineage than previously thought. We also know Homo erectus were among the earliest hominins known to collect naturally occurring pigments like red ochre, although whether this was purely for practical uses like hide tanning or adhesives, or if it had symbolic meaning early on, is harder to say for sure. But the engraved shell is tantalizing.
Okay, one last thing on H. erectus. You mentioned the Homo ergaster debate in the outline. Briefly, what's that taxonomic argument about, splitters versus lumpers?
Exactly. It's a classic paleoanthropological debate. Some researchers argue that the earlier Homo erectus fossils found specifically in Africa, like the very complete skeleton of the Turkana boy, or Nariokotomi boy, are different enough from the later Homo erectus found in Asia to warrant a separate species name. Homo ergaster meaning working man.
So, in that view, ergaster is African, erectus is Asian.
Essentially, yes. In this two-species model, Homo ergaster is seen as the species that evolved in Africa and was likely the direct ancestor of later hominins, including the lineage that eventually led to us, perhaps via an intermediate species like Homo heidelbergensis. The Homo erectus found in Asia, in this view, represents a separate, long-lasting side branch that eventually went extinct without contributing to modern humans.
And the other view, the lumpers.
The lumpers argue that the variation we see between the African and Asian fossils, and even within those regions over time, isn't significant enough to justify splitting them into two species. They see it all as one single, widespread, highly variable species, which they call Homo erectus sensulato, meaning in the broad sense.
So it affects how we draw the lines and arrows on the family tree, who gave rise to whom.
Exactly. It impacts our models of migration and species relationships. But regardless of whether you call the early African forms ergaster or just early erectus, this group of hominins, emerging around 1.9 million years ago, was absolutely critical. They represent that major evolutionary shift towards a modern body plan built for long-distance travel. They were the first to successfully colonize vast new territories outside Africa. They almost certainly controlled fire. They developed more sophisticated Acheulean tool technologies, and their social and cognitive complexity was clearly increasing. They truly set the stage for everything that came after in human evolution.